Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the time ahead of us is somewhat short. This bill is now under a measure to allow it to proceed at a certain pace. And for some, that might seem like a bit of a rush, that this is happening at some accelerated pace. But for those of us who make our homes along the north coast and the northwest of British Columbia, this has been a conversation that's gone on for more than a generation. That we have been talking specifically about the transit of oil across the northwest and off the north coast to some other ports for almost 50 years. I believe it's been 47 years. And I think going back through some of the history would be important to help colleagues and people watching this debate understand how much this has been studied by the Energy Board, by people living in the northwest, by industry, that I'm not sure there is another transit route anywhere in North America that has been looked at so often and so often rejected as a good or potential route to pass oil products through because of some of the inherent risks that make the transit of that oil difficult to do securely. Now, 15 years ago, I started my career in federal politics. And one of our objectives in running for office and ultimately achieving success at the polls was to put Skeena back on the map, to have the conversation that we were having between and within our communities as part of a national dialogue. Issues about the environment and resource exploitation, issues about Indigenous rights and title, and the obligation of the Crown, of this place, to do a much better job than we have historically done through our colonial past. And 15 years ago, when I first rose in Parliament, the issue that we talked about was this, was talking about attempts to protect the North Coast, which by anyone's estimation is deserving of our respect and our protection. Now, in the most recent election in 2015, 4 out of the 5 federal parties, major parties, campaigned on the promise to do exactly what we're doing here today. 70% of the people sitting in this House of Commons, representing over 12 million Canadian voters, campaigned on this promise through that election. And making good on that promise is the least that we can do for the people in the Northwest who have again been discussing this for more than a generation. In 1970, a House of Commons committee first studied this question, saying, is this a good idea or not? Is there a port to the north of Vancouver that would make good sense to transit oil? And that review came up negative. In 1972, the declaration of a moratorium, a voluntary moratorium, an exclusion zone, was put in place. Also in 1972, one of my predecessors, Frank Howard, the MP from Skeena, as it was known at the time, passed a unanimous motion confirming that exclusion zone. All parties in the House of Commons at that time understood the importance of this. It was multi-partisan. It wasn't even partisan or bipartisan. It had all parties in agreement. The Federal Commission struck in 1978, the voluntary agreement with the United States in 1988, reviewed many times since and confirmed each and every time. And then in 2009, Stephen Harper decides to ignore this long-held moratorium. Simply says it was a cabinet utterance, is what he called it, which it was. It had never been written down into law. And therefore, as Prime Minister, he said, I don't need to abide by it. And then opened up the conversation for a proposed project from the company known as Enbridge. They hived off to become Enbridge Northern Gateway, a subsidiary, which is a neat trick the oil and gas companies sometimes do to protect themselves. They create a subsidiary to run a pipeline, and it indemnifies them against legal action if ever there is an accident. This is the same company that spilled massive amounts of oil and diluted bitumen at the Kalamazoo River, which cost many hundreds of millions of dollars and is unable to clean up. The Kalamazoo, by the way, in Michigan and the States, is a very, very shallow, slow-moving, warm river. For anyone familiar with the circumstances of our rivers in British Columbia, particularly northern British Columbia, they are not shallow, they are not slow-moving, and they are not warm. No. And every oil cleanup expert in the world, those based in British Columbia and throughout North America, have described a successful cleanup rate for a diluted bitumen spill on the north coast at less than 7% recovery. Let me repeat that. What would be deemed as a successful cleanup operation, successful, A+, in the event of a spill from a pipeline or by an oil tanker on the North Coast in the waters that we know, 7% recovery, 93% lost into the environment, which, as we know, diluted bitumen sinks and causes havoc and on our rivers and our oceans for our very sustenance. The great privilege that I've had for this decade and a half representing the people of the Northwest is to come to know in some small way the ancient indigenous cultures that have resided there since time immemorial. The Tsimshian, the Haida, the Heiltsuk, the Nuxalk, the Tahltan, the Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en, all the way through into the coast. And the privilege that has been mine is that in learning from that leadership as to what the responsibilities of leaders are, is not simply to care for ourselves in the moment in which we exist, but to, in all of our best efforts, to represent people, to speak on their behalfs, and to leave the place better than we found it. And it was the Haisla leadership in particular, which is in Kitimat, British Columbia, which would have been the terminus for the Northern Gateway Pipeline, who spoke with such firmness and declaration, elected and hereditary leadership together, in rejecting the idea of bringing diluted bitumen to the North Coast, sailing it down the Douglas Channel, trying to, with super tankers, perform 3 90-degree turns before getting into the Hecate Strait between Haida Gwaii, the 4th most dangerous body of water in the world, to attempt to move oil safely hundreds and thousands of times over the course of the life of a pipeline. That there is no reasonable person that can offer the people I represent the assurance that an accident won't happen. And the Exxon Valdez of 1989 was just north of us. And to this day, Mr. Speaker, you can go on the shorelines where the Valdez went down or spilled, and all you have to do is dig half a foot into the gravel banks, and the water that fills back in comes with an oil sheen that is detectable as spillage from the Valdez so many years ago. So I think most Canadians approach these questions in a relatively straightforward way. What are the risks versus the benefits? Yep. Not just to us as a community, but to us as a province and a nation. And the risks that are entertained in trying to move diluted bitumen, any oil product, off the North Coast in super tankers that are not designed for our waters through very narrow and treacherous passageways, so far outweigh any imagined benefits that it's a no-brainer. And I can remember, I don't know if colleagues do, a letter that was issued by the then Natural Resource Minister. It was directed by the Prime Minister's office, we found out later, that said those that are opposed to Northern Gateway are, quoting, enemies of the state and foreign-funded radicals. That's what they called us, Mr. Speaker. Not only was that an incredibly offensive and ignorant thing to say about fellow Canadians from the Prime Minister's office and his minister, it also, I think, ended up having the reverse effect in the place that I represent. Because what they hadn't learned, the former Harper government, was that sometimes those people that are concerned about the environment, worried about oil spilling into our water, into our oceans, into our rivers, are not all wearing Birkenstocks, that are not all fully paid members of Greenpeace, that in fact, in the place that I live, some of the most conservative people I know take that word conservative seriously. To mean, I want to be able to take my kids fishing. I want to be able to take my kids to the out of doors. And I need to respect that place in order to have that privilege, and for them to have that privilege for their children. And when the former government accused us of being radicals, of being foreign-funded stooges to some great grand conspiracy theory, a theory that continues on today, unfortunately, for law-abiding, proper-thinking Canadians that are simply saying, we want a voice in this conversation and you got to listen to us. It was so shameful for any government of any political persuasion to stoop to those tactics, and it had the opposite effect, because people where I live said, how dare you? Right and left and middle and outside, all of our conventional thinking said, how dare you, to the former government. And I think, in fact, it may have in part contributed to their eventual downfall. That the arrogance and the bullying represented in that attitude towards citizens that we seek to represent backfired completely and expose that government to something else. And if I can pause for a moment to former colleagues and current provincial premiers who are waving the national unity flag, here's one way you don't do national unity, is by threatening and bullying other Canadians. You don't bring this country together by yelling at each other. You don't represent the best interests of Canada when you talk to another province in a disrespectful and offensive way. And unfortunately, what we're seeing out of some of our provinces is to suggest that British Columbia, the place that we call home, how dare we stand up for things that we believe in? How dare we represent our views politically and socially? And you can see what's coming out of Edmonton these days, and it will not have the effect that I suppose they are hoping for. To my friends and family in Alberta, who I've spoken to many over these long years, we've been campaigning and talking about this for a long time. We absolutely understand the fear that is exhibited, particularly by those that are involved in the oil industry, because they've had a hard go. Oil went up to extremely high prices, $140 a barrel. Money was easily made through hard work and focus, and then steadily prices collapsed. The economy of Alberta in particular, and Saskatchewan as well, very reliant on that particular economy, also fell in incredibly hard times, and things got more and more tight and desperate. And it felt like the world was lined up against them. No one's controlling oil prices, last I checked, Mr. Speaker, effectively. Not the current government, not past governments. This is the cycle that we have seen many, many times. And in the face of this, we are also collectively challenged with what we are seeing in our world, which are the predictions we were getting in the 80s and 90s and the aughts about the impacts of climate change, that forest fires would become more intense and broader, that floods and storm events would no longer be single-century events, but many times over many years, that we are seeing the impacts and the weather pattern changes that are directly attributable to dangerous climate change. Albertans know this. We saw the floods in Calgary, saw the fires in Fort McMurray, we saw them in my region as well. And I sat down with a forest firefighter just last season, another record and devastating year for those who have ever experienced or been in proximity to an out-of-control forest fire. It is devastating. It is so shaking to our very understanding of what home and security is when we see the full rage and power of Mother Nature in effect. And I was sitting across the lunch table from a firefighter. He's blackened eyes and completely covered in soot. He just got off the line, and he's been fighting fires for 30 years. And I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, it's different. And this guy's to the right of the Till of the Hun. Like, he's way out there in terms of his conservative views on the world. And I said, "How is it different?" And he says, "The impacts of climate. I'm watching this." And I said, "You're putting me on. You're putting me on." He said, "Absolutely not. The way the fires are behaving, the way that things are conducting themselves is not the way that we know." Now, this bill, many in the oil industry are seeking certainty. It's a common refrain. We want certainty. We just want to be able to know what the landscape is. Let me offer this to those interested in certainty. We want certainty too. That for millennia, the people of the North Coast have relied upon the oceans and rivers for our economy, for our basic social fabric, and the sustenance that builds the incredible cultures that we now celebrate and enjoy across the globe. The certainty that we require is that these moratorium that were voluntary, that were utterances from the government, will no longer be uncertain, they will be certain, and that is what this bill does. And it also brings certainty to the industry, because last I checked, someone could correct me, there ain't no one knocking on the door to try to build a diluted bitumen pipeline to the North Coast, because the risks so far outweigh the benefits, because the political and the social environment of the Northwest is so connected to the land, so connected to the oceans and the rivers, that the viability of anyone proposing to build a big old diluted bitumen pipeline and put all of that in super tankers with some faint promise to get it off to overseas markets is not a reality. So let's create that certainty. I mentioned in a question earlier in the debate that I worked alongside of Jim Prentice, who has left us, while he was Environment Minister for the former government. And Jim had come to the North Coast, unlike many people who speak with some sort of authority as to how the North Coast works. And Jim came many times. He saw the splendor and the grandeur. And he worked with us on bringing forward the Great Bear Rainforest Initiative. Had started under a previous Liberal government, but never come to completion. And I worked with Ron Ambrose and John Baird. All these folks that had not exactly hugged a tree every day, but who understood the importance of this part of the world. And we funded that initiative, protecting the largest tract of temperate rainforest in the world, and protecting it in such a way that includes the people who live there. We didn't draw a line on a map around people and say, the local communities aren't important. We included them in the creation of a global leading conservation effort. And we bought back, some companies just simply forgave the permits they had to drill for oil and gas in the Hecate Strait. A preposterous notion for anyone who's ever been across the Hecate Strait. Incredibly shallow, prone to storms, some of the strongest winds in the world, and a place that so relies on the ocean being intact for the survival of the people there, that it was through a conservative, and I got in a lot of trouble for it. Some people said, how dare you work with conservatives to get something done? Remember, there was a headline in the Toronto Star claimed I had sold out. I had sold out. And you wonder sometimes in politics why we lose faith, that something good was done, and I don't care who did it. I don't care who got the credit for it. I just care that it got done, because it was something people in the region wanted. And it was through that conservative government we did that. This is a strange circular moment for me, Mr. Speaker, because when we came in this place, we were fighting to protect the North Coast. And as this parliamentary session winds down and my colleagues turn their eyes towards the next election, those who are reoffering, I think sometimes life offers us a little bit of a bookend to a story, that where you started ends up being where you finish. And for the people I represent, who have been engaged in this battle, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, right and left, rural and urban, for more than 40 years, to see this bill come to pass as one of the last acts of this Parliament, of which there have been disappointments and failures and mistakes, as there always are, they can look to this piece of legislation, know that it is in fact founded in science, know that it is in fact founded in deep and profound consultations that have gone on for decades, and know for a fact that what we are doing as a Parliament here today is good. What we are doing here as colleagues, as parliamentarians, who are called to serve, and in our best ways represent the people of this great country, that we are doing something right. There will be those that think it's wrong, and I would invite them to come to the place where I live. I would invite them to see and meet the people who rely on this place for their very survival. Allow me to end on this. I was in Bella Coola and Bella Bella, Heiltsuk and Newhawk territory just last week. And it was in the Heiltsuk territory where the Nathan E. Stewart went down, a relatively small segregated barge. And the world-class oil spill response that this country has claimed to have for 20 years was unable to handle a relatively small spill that took place on the clam beds and areas where salmon spawn, vital to the Heiltsuk Nation. And that experience was traumatizing for people there. It was traumatizing because they had been warning the federal government for many years. The cleanup spill is insufficient. Our navigational responses are insufficient, and what we are trying to protect is so precious to us because we can't go anywhere else. This is our home. This is where our ancestors are buried. And in watching the response, the brave response from that community, and knowing the risks posed by a much, much larger and more devastating spill, I thought the least we can do is listen. Politicians aren't always great at it, Mr. Speaker. We like to talk. I've been talking for a little bit here. We've had many failures in this place. Parliament has failed rural people, Indigenous people, more often than not. Every once in a while, we can do something right, we can do something good. Passing this bill, enshrining what has existed for many decades into law, will be doing something right, and I believe doing our jobs on behalf of all Canadians. Thank you very much.